them first being free. So the Civil War is a major backdrop to the genealogy story of how we think about, how we write about, how we develop public policies in relation to the problem of black people as criminals. It is a post-slavery development. And one of the most fascinating things about this moment is, looking back from where we are in 2013, and I hope I'll convince you of this by the time we finish, there's no moment in American history where the question of black people's criminality, how much crime do they commit, what types of crime do they commit, were not driving basic questions about their citizenship rights, about the quality of education they should have, about where they should live, about whose daughters they can date. Everything from work to school to play to leisure at the moment of the end of slavery was defined to one degree or another by the question of how much crime do black people commit. In fact, I would argue with you that the basic wiring in this room, we like to think we're very high-tech. We certainly have tremendous access to information in ways that are simply mind-boggling. It's both portable, it's both fast, it's both seemingly infinite. But the bottom line is, what drives most of our devices is the same alternating currents running through wires in our walls. And depending on where you live in New Jersey, or what home you happen to live in, you might live in a 100-year-old house that has the same basic wiring as was invented in Thomas Edison's laboratory in West Orange, New Jersey. So for all our high-techness, we still live with an old infrastructure that illuminates and empowers us. The analogy here is that these ideas that Ray Kelly is drawing upon, the ways in which we think, talk, and respond to the idea of black people as criminals is as old as the late 19th century when electricity illuminated the world. That's a claim, it's an argument, and I'm going to spend the next 30 minutes proving it to you. And then we'll have some Q&A and you can tell me what you think about it. So, one of the things that drives the debate today about black criminality and what we ought to do about it is, of course, statistics. It is the bread and butter of social science and scientific investigation. It is that gold standard that I first mentioned. And so, as it turns out, the very first moment when there is a statistic that communicates information about black people is with the 1890 U.S. Census. It was the first U.S. Census that was treated with respect and was considered credible because, for two reasons. It was the first census that could reasonably sample the population of African Americans, because the first two representing the first two after the end of slavery, because you have to understand, although black people were counted as slaves, once they were essentially citizens, the Civil War had devastated the infrastructure of the South. Less reliable because sampling techniques had a big asterisk next to them. And again, I've got budding social scientists in the room so you understand some of these terms. It simply just wasn't authoritative enough. But something else about the 1890 census that really mattered. It mattered because the major debates that were the set of ideas that gave birth to physical war, the pro-slavery idea versus the abolitionist idea, the idea that black people were natural drawers of wood and hewers of wood and drawers of water, that they were built for manual labor, that God in His infinite wisdom had created categories of humanity and that skin color was a marker of the inferior nature of black people, that the history of Africa, a place without a history, was proof that black people were not capable of the demands of high civilization. All of those ideas that were in circulation, that is, moving through society, justifying slavery for those who were in defense of slavery, were challenged by the abolitionists, said God had created one man, it was humanity, skin color was not a marker of difference, black people were capable of achieving intellectually, socially, politically, and culturally, just like white people if given a fair chance. All of those ideas were unresolved by the war. The war simply forced the question to the nation of actual political citizenship. It did not resolve the question of the quality of man, or in this case, man and woman. That question remained debatable, and indeed it was the backdrop for how Reconstruction proceeded. It was the backdrop to how Reconstruction ended. It gave birth to a more explicit discourse and language about white supremacy and white rule. It gave legitimacy to racial violence in the South, from Klan violence to lynching. In other words, the world of ideas about black people's capabilities actually intensified after the war. Because slavery, in a sense, forestalled the necessity for some of those grand debates. They did form the backdrop of the Civil War in defense of it, but once the war was over, now the real question of where should these people live, where should they work, where should they play, how should they move through society, starting to sound familiar. And so the 1890 census, as it turns out, is the first census to provide authoritative evidence of how an entire generation of black people who had never been touched by slavery were faring in society. I can't emphasize that enough because we are accustomed in our day and age with regular benchmarks or report cards or anniversaries or the state of the nation's educational achievement or the latest uniform crime report or the decennial results of population change. There's a lot of benchmarks that we are bombarded with in our society, particularly as data becomes more and more available and easily communicated. We just keep hearing what is the latest. One of the cautions I would make for those future social scientists is, if you think about social scientists as a recipe for social transformation, think about how easy it is to spend your whole life waiting for the newest data to show up so you can say something about it. Maybe take a step back and say, maybe last year's data is good enough. Maybe even 5 years ago's data is good enough, as long as I can see that the trends remain the same and things haven't reversed course. Because there's something about the abundance of data that distracts those who think data can be in the service of social transformation, and you never get away from the data. You're always chasing the latest data. And so this world is coming into being. The 1890 census is a terrific moment for the explosion of all kinds of demographic-based data, not just about the race question, not just about the race problem, not just about the future of black people. It's also a moment when the second industrial revolution is causing tremendous upheaval in terms of the economic plight of people who are working class, who are new immigrants, who are from Europe, who are from the Caribbean. Many people are trying to figure out where they're going to fit into society, and hence sociology is born. It is a combination of political economy, of social work, but by 1892 the University of Chicago puts a sign on its door, open for business, and begins to turn to census data and other available local data to make certain claims about how people are doing in society. And so this 1890 census was the nation's first report card on how black people actually were able to survive without having, if you're a pro-slavery person, the beneficent hand of slavery on you, taking care of your basic needs, providing food and shelter, Christian guidance. Some of you have seen 12 Years a Slave, and Master Ford is delivering the Sunday sermon to his enslaved people at his plantation. Or, if you are former abolitionists, to remove the abusive, destructive, denigrating, dehumanizing hand of slavery. Either way, these folks had not experienced slavery, a generational cohort. So you're 25 years old, having been born in 1865 by the time of 1890. So it produced tremendous energy and excitement within the burgeoning social scientific community to say, well, damn it, now we can actually find out what black people are capable of. We can resolve the debate. But the very question that was being asked in the moment was predicated on a notion of inferiority. Essentially, the deck was already stacked against African Americans. The very way in which the research question itself was framed was meant to produce knowledge, to answer a basic question that already assumed that black people had basic deficits in society. That's another important one. And it comes back to the first 2 points on this slide. One is that statistical knowledge or statistical discourse, particularly in the case of race, is never value neutral. We don't produce knowledge in a vacuum. We don't ask research questions that are completely divorced from any pertinent social questions that we find relevant to what we do. And in fact, the RAND Producing Certain Knowledge Corporation about whether or not it is appropriate to essentially discriminate against population groups that knowingly have higher crime rates is itself, the question is asked in relation to the defense of certain policies. It's just the way it is. So in 1890, the U.S. Census revealed, as is no surprise to you since you've been looking at the slide for a few minutes now, that 12% of the population that was African American, the general U.S. population of black people, not much different from today, turned out to be 30% of the nation's prisoners. Now, if we just paused and stopped and reflected on that, we might think back to, for some of the faculty in the room, John Singleton's use of statistical knowledge to frame the end of Boys in the Hood, which was a film about inner-city gang violence and the challenges that young black boys faced growing up. He ends it citing the statistics that 1 in 4 black men between the ages of 18 and 24 were under some form of correctional supervision. This was back in 1995. Some of you know about Mark Maurer's work, Verse to Incarcerate, published in 1999, that picked up on this theme and essentially helped to popularize it. And of course, Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, that has done tremendous work more recently in elevating knowledge about the scale of the incarceration system. But my point is that this basic idea that there's evidence, unimpeachable, authoritative evidence, that there's a disproportionate number of black people in prison relative to the population was meant in 1890 to provide smoking gun evidence that black people were inferior and did not deserve the full fruits of freedom. So the linkage between the statistical evidence and the interpretation of the evidence was framed, like the wiring in this room, 120 years ago. That's a point that if nothing else comes out of this, you have to understand, because the separation of that, the breaking of that, comes about for European immigrants in ways that it does not for African Americans. Now, what does this number actually mean? Because my scientific colleagues in the room will say, well, surely we would expect some offending population among black people, as would be true of any other population group. And we could talk about the social construction of crime, but at some basic level, once we try to disaggregate and discount all of the ways in which crime and the definition of offending is a social construction itself, that the law is a moving target, both in its definition and in the application of the law, right? So, social construction of law 101, right? The law itself is a product of bias at various levels of society. What we define as illegal is the product of politics. It's not purely a moral construct. And then secondarily, how we prosecute is based on all sorts of factors. So we can have laws, but necessarily not use them fairly. So you all get that. I won't spend any more time on it. But once we distill all of that, some of you might still come to the conclusion that, but of course, some percentage of black people were really bad and did a lot of terrible things, and what were you supposed to do, even in the interest of protecting the black community? But this wasn't a debate with a bunch of footnotes on it. This, in fact, was a debate that was meant to simplify the problem. So you take the race problem, which is the problem of black people as free people, as citizens of the nation state, with the same rights as white folks, which was a very discomforting reality in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. To some degree, the same is true today. And then you take that reality and match it to a form of evidence that seems to say You don't have to wear the badge of being biased against black people if you just look at their criminality. That we can all agree that this is a threat. But what did that number actually mask? So I'll ask probably my